Okay, hello everyone and welcome back to the now 8th part of the Q&A series in the context of the lecture series True Dhamma, following in the footsteps of the Buddha. With me, again, we have Saif and myself, Florian, and today we will answer a few more questions that were left unanswered last time. And yeah, I will just start with the first one. And this question is from an anonymous person and it has been asked a lot. And the person wants to know, my perception of non-self is flickering and unstable. I know that all the 5 aggregates are impermanent, but my experience does not confirm it at all times. What am I missing? And maybe before we answer that, that person here is quite advanced. So you should keep that in mind. If you can, to some degree at least, see non-self, then you are on a very good way. But that person has not yet stabilized that way of perceiving. Let's put it like that. So yeah, maybe you want to answer that. I think you have answered it quite a few times already on Discord.
Yeah. So I mean, the main thing is that you have to realize that if you understand dependent origination fully, the fact that the experience as a whole is being conditioned by something, for example, the body, to realize that if it's being understood fully, there's no way I can be unstable, because whether you do something, whether you don't do something, whether you perceive this, whether you don't perceive this, whether you're mindful, whether you're non-mindful, whether you forget, literally whatever it can be, it's all within the context of your understanding. Whatever's happening, it's on the basis of the body. So you realize if you have fully understood dependent origination, there is no more having to like do mindfulness and so on. It's just automatically there. It's constant. So if it is unstable, it means there is an extent basically to which you are not seeing certain phenomena as determined and conditioned. And usually it's that person has to basically do the mindfulness, which means they're still putting the focus on their doing their sense of self rather than the thing that sense of self is being conditioned by. And it's completely normal, because obviously when you first start out, natural mind is going towards sensuality and so on. So there's a difference between mind that's unmindful and mind that is remembering to be mindful and so on. That's a natural division that's made. But at some point, you have to actually start giving up the doing of the mindfulness, the forgetting and then coming back to it. You have to realize that whether you're mindful or not mindful, whether you're doing the mindfulness or not, either one is within the context of the body being there first. You realize that the body, either way, it comes first. And that's the full understanding of dependent origination. Because as long as you're doing the mindfulness, you're putting your action first and the body second, which means the sense of self is always going to remain to that extent. So yeah, you basically have to contemplate that. But as we've talked about before as well, the thing that's going to be disastrous to not understanding that is distraction, basically. Too much talk, too much company, too much sleep, too much responsibilities. It's going to be a basis for not understanding that and having to do the mindfulness. But yeah, if you're very secluded, if you spend time in a retreat or whatever, you can then, binding in non-activity, you can just contemplate that context, that whether I forget or not, the body comes first. And at some point, that clarity will have to emerge. And then when it becomes impossible to do anything, and for that doing to make delusion come back, that's how you can know you've abandoned Upadana and self-view. And then, yeah, you've entered the stream. There's no more you can do that basically can bring sense of self back. But yeah, that takes basically just development of that context. Further clarity to the extent which the body or feeling or whatever, it comes first, not my action, not my doing, not my mindfulness.
Yeah. Maybe one more thing to add. If you are flickering in that sense, then it's, I mean, Saif has said that, but I will just emphasize that one more time. Then it's pretty much always because your restraint is not well established enough. The foundation to see non-self in its entirety is not there. So you can have that perception in some areas, but still not in others, if you are simply not restrained enough. So if you are still distracting yourself all the time, then you will not see that. It is quite impossible to see that even under those circumstances. So you must strengthen the foundation for that perception. And that's how you can actually make it permanent. Well, permanent. Yeah. So that's probably what most people are missing. Just don't distract yourself as best as you can. Secluded, all those things. I mean, the Buddha talked about it all the time. No.
Yeah, that's right. The Buddha always talks about, like, be heedful, there's empty huts and so on. If you do want to do the practice, you need to, when you get that deep insight, you need to spend time alone and, do the reflection. Like so many suttas, like I heard the Buddha's teaching, I went to the empty hut, I followed the churning of the 5 aggregates, and then the path was born. And that's what you need to do. Seclude yourself and then contemplate that context. And you need that full clarity to set in of the Sankhara determining your experience.
Like everything, every part of your experience. That is the important part. The self cannot have any place to hide, or it will hide there. So that's maybe important.
Yeah. That's why we talk so much about, like, the universal nature of things, the framework. That's why the Sotapada's insight is whatever arises, it is subject to cessation. Because you realize, if I put this in the background, it doesn't matter what's in the foreground, whatever's experienced, simultaneously I know it's being conditioned. And so, nothing can be on them.
Yeah, I think that answers that question. Let us move to the next one. And this question is from Halim B. And he wants to know, what's your opinion on the Buddha entering the first jhana as a child or young person under the Bodhi tree, or when his father was doing some work? Was he a stream enterer then? Also, he learned the rest of the jhanas from other teachers, like, I forgot the names, sadly, Alara Galama, I think, and others. Were they stream enterers? Also, he arguably went very far, mastering all the states of samadhi, as the stories go. The Buddha was not a stream enterer as a child. When we say, and just want to make that clear, that people usually need to have the right view before they enter jhana, we literally mean, given that there is a Dhamma around, given that there is Buddhism that people teach, then they will very likely reach stream entry first and then the first jhana. Because in essence, the first jhana is a bit harder to attain than stream entry, if you go by the description of the Buddha. So the Buddha, as he was still a bodhisattva, as a child, was not a stream enterer, but he was very pure. His mind was incredibly pure compared to the minds of most people nowadays. So he could slip into those states when the conditions were right. And those teachers, his prior teachers, were also incredibly developed when it comes to the practice of jhana. I mean, they could attain the 7th and the 8th jhana, so they were pretty much unbothered by anything that presented themselves in their experience. But they were missing the core insight, namely the insight on dependent origination. So they were not noble in that sense. They were very developed, but it was not the insight that was special to the Buddhas that they had. Only that makes you a stream enterer, the point of no return. Those people were free for 40,000 eons of time, 60,000 eons of time, from all suffering. But then it comes back. Then they are reborn in a place of misery because their good karma has been used up. So that is the distinguishing mark, as we repeat over and over again, the right view. Anything you want to add?
Those teachers that did all the jhanas, they were doing all the right things. They did all the right restraint and everything. It was just that core insight. And that's why when the Buddha got enlightened, he was going to go teach you the Dhamma. But they died recently. And he said, it's such a shame. Because, if they just heard like a sentence or two from the Buddha, because they're doing all the practice already and attained all the jhanas, just that one core insight would have fully liberated them. Jhanas, they're basically doing all the practice for you. It's just they need that little extra insight into dependent origination and not self to fully unbind the experience. But like we've said before, there's no self in jhana. That's why it's the most wholesome thing.
Yeah. It's just that pretty much the underlying tendency for the self to come back is still there. It's still hanging on there by a fraction of like a hair strength of tethering.
Yeah.
Especially in the highest.
That's why it's like the noble disciple it's on a different level to, someone who's attained all the jhanas completely, because you can be restrained, fully pure, but you will not have touched in any way the actual root of all suffering. That's why the Noble Eightfold Path didn't exist until the Buddha arose. Even though people were practicing the jhanas, people were practicing the right livelihood, the right effort, and so on, because they didn't have the knowledge of the root of suffering, they did not have the Noble Eightfold Path. They weren't noble disciples. So that little thing, it makes all the difference.
No. Technically...
Yeah. Also, like... Yeah, go on.
Oh, sorry. Technically, even the lowest attainment in the Buddha's dispensation of the faith follower, as an example, is worth more than the attainment of the, 8th jhana without the right view. So they are, as I've mentioned, on a completely different level. Yeah, sorry. I did not want to interrupt you.
I forgot what I was going to say, but yeah, like uprooting suffering, it's completely different to mere restraint. It's just... No. Nothing can be more important to understand, really. It's all about, because you can go to any other teachers and you can learn extremely lofty states, but only the Buddha can fully uproot the suffering.
No. Yeah. Many times it's not even something that people think is possible. For them, they have to repeat their sensual tasks that makes them feel good for all their lives and probably many future lives to come. For them, it's inconceivable that there could be an end to all of that. And this is what the Buddha uniquely offers. Like actually being done.
Yeah. It's a very hard thing to understand, I think, until you actually experience it, really.
Yeah, but I think that's a very detailed answer to that question. So let us move on to the next one. And this one is from an anonymous person. And that person asks, how do I know that I can believe you? How do I know if someone is truly a Sotapanna and thus a person I can or should listen to? It's for you.
The bottom line is that you can't, basically. You can't know for sure. And it's similar to the other things we've been talking about in terms of teachers and traditions, is that, ultimately you can only trust the Buddha and the Suttas and the Vinaya and so on. That's your benchmark. You can listen to other teachers, you can listen to us and so on, but we're only helpful to the extent that we can illuminate the suttas, basically. And you should compare what we say to the suttas and see if it's in line with it, if what we emphasize is the same thing the Buddha and his disciples emphasize and so on. But even then, like, you should always be taking it with at least a little bit of grain of salt until you have actually eradicated doubt yourself, because that's the only place that matters, really. The only place that matters is you crossing the shore and attaining certainty. And before then, anything you're doing, it could be wrong. So you don't want to trap yourself in doing something, practicing it for 20 years and even gain lots of positive effects, but have no idea about how to uproot your suffering. So you need to be vigilant, but also you need to be listening to teachers where possible, taking on board, and just being independent, really, thinking about it clearly, reflecting on it, but never stopping until you reach the other shore, basically.
No. I think there is also one sutta that literally says that. Like, when people heard something from another teacher, they should neither agree nor disagree, just keep it in mind and then compare with the suttas. That is literally the Buddha's advice. If you stick to that, then you're in a very good way. Because the suttas, again, you have to go by faith with that, but they are flawless. At least the, I think, 9 books or 10 books that I have listed at the beginning of the lecture. Those can be trusted. The rest, not so much, maybe, but again, you have to see that for yourself. Just go out, listen to others, maybe they can explain in a very relatable way to you, but then go back to the suttas and see if it's actually in there. That would be very important.
So if someone is saying something against the suttas, like if someone is saying solitude is not necessary or celibacy is not necessary, you can know that that teacher is not teaching in the right way. Because the Buddha clearly says all these things, even if it's harsh, even if it's like against the ways of the world and so on. That's what the Buddha says is necessary for liberation.
No. The Dhamma is not always pleasant sounding. Even if it is the most sublime thing, as it goes against what you have been doing for probably eons of lives, it will be unpleasant to hear. Oh. So yeah, ultimately you cannot know. Compare with the suttas. Oh. Okay, let's move to the next question. And this person wants to know, I have some idea what sankharas are in general, but what is their role in the context of the 5 aggregates in contrast to dependent origination? And this is a very loaded question that we get a lot, actually. Most of the people that ask are asking some things concerning dependent origination, sankharas, and all those things. And yeah, we have the difference between the aggregate of sankharas and we have the, let's say, principle of sankharas, the principle of dependent origination, where one thing depends on another thing. With this, that is. Without this, that cannot be. And yeah, you could think about the aggregate of sankharas as a special case, so to speak, of the others. Those are also sankharas, but it's more useful to think about them as, well, as they are often translated as intentions. So things that feel like doing is what I like to translate them, or what I like to phrase them. Everything in your experience that feels like doing, that feels intentional, that feels directional. That's a good way, in my opinion, of explaining sankharas as an aggregate as compared to the principle. The principle is just what we always say all the time. Background, foreground feels like, well, what you put your attention on and what that attention depends upon. That is sankhara in the most general sense. And in the context of the 5 aggregates, they also fulfill that role as intentions determine actions that can follow from them and keep the entire samsara going. Oh. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, it's the same principle either way, in terms of it's something that things stand upon. But as far as the aggregates go, it's just a more particularized form. It's the intentions which fuel your experience and fuel the samsara and so on, rather than the overall principle.
No.
So, yeah.
I think when the Buddha explained dependent origination, he had a few different viewpoints on them. Sometimes he talked about it as a structural principle, and sometimes he talked about it in terms of nutriments, things that actually, through your actions, so to speak, fuel the entire process of being and becoming and all of that. So the 5 aggregate stuff is more related to that, your actual actions, like eating physical food is a nutriment for future becoming, in a sense. Yeah. Maybe that's a good way of thinking about it and the difference. Yeah. Let's move on to the next question. And this one is from an anonymous person. And that person says, it is easy for me to live celibate as I have no opportunity for sexual intercourse. What are other ways I can develop restraint? And this question is for you.
Well, even before the sexual intercourse, the other thing you're going to be restraining is obviously, no sexual acts beyond that. So obviously, like, don't masturbate, don't watch pornography and things like that. But then also developing like further mental celibacy of not delighting in wanting to view women or men, for example, or you need to think about basically, I'm celibate now because I don't have the opportunity for sexual intercourse, but maybe in the future I will have the opportunity. Will my mind at that point then lie towards it, or will I be dispassionate towards it then? So that's the kind of restraint you need to be developing the overall dispassion towards sexual craving by contemplating that entire domain and not specific sexual acts. Because at some point the opportunity may arise, and then because you haven't uprooted that craving, then celibacy will be broken. The Buddha talked about it, like, once you're restrained from sexual intercourse, you further develop the celibacy by not thinking back to times when I was around women and delighting in that and so on. And it just gets more and more subtle. Or either way, what you're doing is wanting to escape the whole domain of sexual passion, seeing that as something not worth having.
Yeah. And it's maybe also important to notice that the lack of opportunity is not freedom from at all. That is very important. If you are involuntarily celibate, that means that you still value sexuality. And if you value it on the level of the mind, then it will at some point find footing in physical actions. And that is what we ultimately try to uproot, the mental relationship to everything, pretty much. Yeah, I think that answers that question quite well. Let's move to the next one. Maybe one more remark. There is a sutta that the Buddha spoke to a certain Brahmin, where that Brahmin was rationalizing. He might have been physically secluded from sexuality, but he was still spending time with women, like caressing them or hugging them, or those things. And then the Buddha lists, I think that sutta was the one you were referring to, then he still thinks about them or looks at them and all those things in a craving related way. So you have to gradually wean yourself off, in a sense, and only when you have no delight left, so to speak, is the task fully developed, so that the mental delighting is gone. No.
Mental delighting and mental value in general.
Yeah, that is the point that is most important. The other things are just means to an end to get there. Yeah. Okay, let's move to the next one. And this one is from another person, from another anonymous person. The person wants to know, do faith followers or people who use faith as their vehicle in general have an easier time practicing Dhamma? And this one is it for you? Yeah, probably.
Yeah. I don't think you can say either way. I think some faith followers will have very difficult practice. Some faith followers will have very easy practice, depending on so many reasons, so many, faculties, karma, and so on. And there's no easy way to say. You just have to practice with what you've got, and don't lament. If you're not someone who is going towards faith, if you're someone who needs a lot of mental work to basically understand the Dhamma, that's just what you have to do. And it might be more unpleasant, but you just keep doing it, and at some point the fruits will arise, and then it'll become easy.
Yeah. I would not think too much about having better or worse circumstances than others or anything like that. There's no real benefit in such contemplations, if you want. It's just, if people have an easier time, then they did the work in the past, maybe in a past life or something like that. It is difficult for basically everyone, to be honest. So restraint is never easy, even if you have faith. It's not really something that just comes for free. There is still immense pressure that the entire central domain exerts on you, even if you have faith or not. It might give you an edge, but ultimately it's still a lot of pressure.
Yeah. There is a reason why the Buddha talks so much about that contemplation, about being the owner of your actions, because it is a completely universal principle, and it's true. Like every action you do, it will ripen, and all your circumstances are due to your own actions.
No.
Okay. Even if you don't see that right now, but it's still the case. And the reason why I said to contemplate that, because if you do contemplate that, you will feel the weight of it. You won't be able to be unmindful anymore, because you will experience the ripening of that karma unless you escape.
No. And it's a principle that you at least can see in this life. even if not in the past lives. Everything you do right now, or everything you have done in the past, had led you to where you are right now, and was always based on desire. You do the things that you do because you want to do them, and that leads you to where you are. And if you apply the same principle just to the past, you pretty much end up at rebirth. Your situation you were put into, so to speak, by cosmic luck, has been conditioned by something. So, it's a useful way of contemplating that, because it can get rid of a lot of envy, as an example. Many people are struck by envy. They think, oh, other people had so much luck in their cosmic lottery. They are born into so much better conditions than if only I were rich and everything. That's not useful. Not useful at all.
There's one thing about this question, I guess, is that people who are more wisdom-oriented often have trouble with enduring doubt, because it is a much more subtle phenomenon to endure. It's easy to, at some point, censorship might become natural, but as we said before, you need to give the question to yourself, but then learn how to not answer it and just endure doubt. And because the Dhamma is not necessarily about having the answers to questions, it's not about having all the right views and so on. The right view is the one that makes you abandon all the views. So, you need to endure doubt to understand it. Yeah. It's a subtle phenomenon that needs to be developed.
Yeah, I think that answers that question in a lot of detail, so we can move to the next one. I'm not sure how much time we have in this recording. It feels longer than the others, but yeah. The next question is from another anonymous person. Is teacher or person X a Sotapanna or an Arahant? Question that many people ask all the time. And I think we kind of have answered that question before. The simple answer is you cannot know, you cannot tell from the outside if you are not a Sotapanna or of right view yourself. And even then, you can only kind of question another person skillfully, and then you get an idea if they have the right view or not. But there's no external mark or feature that you can use to diagnose a Sotapanna or an Arahant. From the outside, they look identical to before. They are probably a bit more restrained than other people, but there's nothing that you can just use to tell them apart from other people. So even the Buddha has been mistaken at his time with just random monks quite frequently. The first people who encountered him have not noticed him as a Buddha at all. And as I mentioned in, I think, lecture 2, the Buddha was likely bald and without that fancy haircut. He was just an ascetic like everyone else. And so it was easy to mistake him for other monks. So you cannot tell. You have to understand, and then you can get an idea if that person has the noble attainment of the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. And I think there is a verse from the Therigatha where it says, one who sees, namely sees dependent origination, sees who sees and sees who does not. And that is pretty much the only thing that you can do. So if you want to know if another person is a Sotapanna or likely an Arahant, become a Sotapanna yourself, and then you can get an inkling. Yeah. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I guess the other thing is that you don't need to know if anyone's a Sotapanna or not. You need to understand the sutras, and everything in the sutras is there. You just need to actually. The only thing that stops people from understanding the sutras is them reading it and expecting to understand it from just reading it. You have to actually do all the practice first, and then it reveals itself. And it's just not doing the practice is why you can't understand it. You don't really need another teacher necessarily, and so on.
No. You do not really need knowledge, you need instructions. You need to know what to do and not. Yeah, that's very important to keep in mind. It's not about answering all the questions, it's about doing the right things.
Even all the things we're saying right now, it's going to stay at the level of mental models until you actually spend the time in seclusion, start abiding without sensuality and so on, and then you'll start to just notice the things we're talking about. But until then, it's They're just thoughts, right?
Yep. Based on the seclusion and everything, it will be the most natural and obvious thing to realize. But without it, it's just words and thoughts and all of that.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay.
You don't want to become just a collector of ideas, you know. You need to do the work.
Yeah. It's all about the work. There are so many suttas on that too, but I don't want to get into too much detail on that. I think I gave you some in the lecture. Anyway, let us move to the next question. And this one is from an anonymous person that wants to know, can insights be unpleasant? Some people say that there is something like a very long, dark night. And this one is for you.
Yeah, insights can be very unpleasant, especially if you're not prepared in virtue and restraint and so on. Seeing not self or contemplating death or something. So it's undoing everything that you know, everything that you depend on, and the dangers become very apparent. Even like we were talking about before about contemplating that I am the owner of my actions. Even that can be very unpleasant if you think about it and feel the weight of it. In the suttas, when the Buddha taught mindfulness of death, some people were so repulsed that they committed suicide and so on. So there is a danger there, but that's why you gradually train. Because if you have virtue and a certain level of sense restraint there, then your mind can usually handle it very easily and so on. This all being said, there is a lot of proliferation ideas about the dark night online and so on, which are not always very accurate. So I wouldn't really look too much about, the 16 stages of insight and so on and trying to map it towards that. Just practice the virtue and sense restraint and think about not self. And yeah, there can be unpleasant things, but if you train gradually, usually it's completely fine, really. It can be like if you have the non-remorse already and certain level of restraint, which you're very comfortable with, that extra renunciation, it can be very pleasant because you've already seen the positive effects of it. It's usually only when you're still very attached to sensuality and so on, trying to undo that all at once. It's undoing your actual existence. So yeah, well, a lot of the online ideas are very proliferated and
that's
not always related to actual insights and so on.
No. If you renounce a lot of sensuality at once, it will feel like dying, and that's very unpleasant. So you have to be careful, proceed it gradually, and then things will work out. Especially if your virtue is good, then it's barely a shrugging things off. Yeah, okay. It truly is like the Buddha said, there is nothing worth holding on to. So be it. And then you move on, and it's quite a big relief when there's nothing you have to protect, as an example. And when it comes to those dark night stages that I think Ingram or someone else online lays out, I don't think that many, let's say, serious practitioners who really practice what the Buddha is teaching, I don't think that they really experience that, what's laid out there. I could never relate to this cycling business or something like that they talk about a lot and really make an entire complex of ideas and write entire books about that. Only when you refuse to let go of sensuality can sensuality come always back to haunt you, and that's a problem maybe, that they refuse to renounce certain things, and then you can have a very long dark night.
Yeah. There's a lot of people that do, like, if your practice is centered around meditation and you see things within your meditation, but outside of your meditation you're still engaged with sensuality, then that's exactly why there's going to be that discrepancy. That's why at least I've talked a little bit about thinking yourself as a renunciate more than a meditator, because if you've done the renunciation part, then insights can be pleasant actually.
I actually like the distinction.
What you're actually doing. Yeah.
That's a very good way of putting it. It really shifts the context towards the right things, namely renouncing and not so much about meditating. It's much more all-encompassing and much more permanent, and it has a much higher weight to it. If you're actually renounced, then it's not going to come back. As in, when you meditate, it can also be a hobby or something. Renunciation cannot be a hobby. That's impossible. Yeah, but I think we are approaching the time limit. So maybe let's move to the next question. Okay, the next question is from an anonymous person. And that person wants to know, what are some of the mistakes you made on the path that others can learn from and avoid? Do you want to start, or should I start? I think we should both answer that one.
Yeah, sure, I'll start. I mean, I feel like I might sound like a broken record, but I could probably subsume all the mistakes I made in the past on the rubric of just saying that I focused too much on meditation and not the overall practice of renunciation, basically. I think I just basically had the attitude of like trying these different meditation techniques and then hoping that one of them would give me some sort of insight, which would basically do the work of renunciation for me. Like I would do meditation and then something would happen and automatically sensuality will not be appealing and practice will be kind of done. But at some point I realized that you kind of just have to do the work of making your mind stronger and actually doing the practice of like living secluded from sensual pleasures, from ill will, from distraction, and enjoying that and not focusing so much on this activity of meditation, constantly calming your mind, but just living secluded from craving. I think once I did that, then everything kind of came into perspective.
Yeah, I think it was very similar for me. In the beginning, I was driven by the existential kind of suffering. So that was always good in a sense when it comes to practice, because there is very immediate feedback if you are doing it right or wrong and everything like that. And so there weren't too many mistakes because it was an urgent concern. But afterwards, I tend to get sidetracked quite a bit. And that was not too good. And I think I ran into the same problems. In the beginning, my entire life revolved around the practice because there was always existential suffering. And when there is existential suffering, your mind wants to solve that problem. And when you have tried everything, there is only Dhamma left. So everything went smooth at that point. But afterwards, it did not. And the practice moved into the 2 hours to 3 hours of meditation each day slot. And that is not what will bring the results. It has to transform your entire life. Otherwise, it is not Dhamma. Otherwise, it is a nice pause of, the regular lifestyle while you are sitting on a cushion. And even then, you are following the same principle very likely. So that is, I think, the main problem of most people, that it's a very narrow definition of meditation. Meditation is everything you do your entire life, if you do it rightly. And otherwise, it is just incomplete practice. If you only have your jhana and your virtue while you are sitting, then you are not practicing. And I fell for that. And that took some time to get rid of those wrong views concerning that. Because it's always the idea that underlies that. If you are convinced that that is a practice, then you will only do that and expect results from it. Only when you let go of the view that meditation is only happening or practice is only happening on the cushion, then can you actually start making progress. So that is the biggest mistake. And all the others were very minor compared to that. So I think that's what most people actually have to keep in mind. Yeah. And I think it's the same for most people actually nowadays. Even so, many of the teachers, of the good teachers, tell you that sitting meditation is only a tiny part of the practice. For example, Ayakema says that quite often. You have to practice the entire time, not just 2 hours on a cushion. Everything else is a practice. On the cushion is just a nice complementary style of practice. But anything you want to add? Or should we move to the next question?
No, let's move to the next question, I think.
Perfect. Then let us move to the next one. And this one is also from another anonymous person. And that person wants to know, how do I develop the Yoniso manasikara, or right attention, or womb attention, that the Buddha explains as so important? And I guess I start on this one. For Yoniso manasikara, which just means quite literally womb attention, you need the ability to attend to one thing while knowing another thing at the same time. So that is more or less the definition of mindfulness. Whenever the Buddha explained it, he said, when a monk is walking, he knows that he is walking. When a monk is sitting, he knows that he is sitting. When he breathes in long, he knows that he breathes in long. When he breathes out short or in short, he knows what is going on. Pretty much whatever he's doing, he has clear awareness of what is going on. So those two things at once are one of the preconditions to develop it. And then you also need the utterance of another. You need another person who points you to that direction. And yeah, based on that, you can start to direct your attention towards the Sankhara part of your experience, pretty much. Namely, and I think we discussed it in many other questions before, one part of your experience, for example, your body, is a condition for the entirety of your other experience. And you want to know, for example, your body as the womb that gives birth to the rest of your experience. And for that to happen, you need quite good mindfulness. You need weak craving. You have to have strong virtue, pretty much. You have to have a good understanding and a good grasp of the instructions of the Buddha. And then the right view, which is pretty much womb attention, it's kind of the same thing, will naturally arise. And it needs that fertile ground of virtue, otherwise it cannot settle in. So that is always important to keep in mind. Yeah, and then you have to contemplate dependent origination and all the other things, and the right view will arise. Yeah. Anything you want to add on that one?
Yeah, you can think as well of as virtue kind of developing the beginnings of Yoniso manasikara in a sense, because if you're being watchful of your intentions all the time, you'll quickly start to realize the only things that start to matter in your experience are lust, aversion, and delusion. And the particular things you're doing, like for example, if you're getting angry at a particular person, or you have sensual desire towards this particular cake or this particular food, and the particular things stop mattering, and all you start to focus on is basically lust, aversion, delusion, that universal background framework. And that's exactly what Yoniso manasikara basically is. It's developing the knowledge of the background. So that's why we say virtue needs to be developed beforehand, because developing virtue is developing Yoniso manasikara. And then once it's developed enough, once you've got enough space between the background and all this being absorbed in all these particular things, then you can direct it, like Flau says, towards the proper womb attention of dependent origination. And that's basically the right view.
Yeah, it's kind of important because the intentions, well, whenever the Buddha explained, for example, virtue, it pretty much boils down to intentions or actions that are rooted in the intentions of greed, aversion, and delusion. And that, as you rightly said, is pretty much already a background, a womb. There are many, well, you can say there are many wombs, there are many things that condition your experience. And one of them is also your intentions. So developing that already, is pretty much the practice. Yeah. That is why virtue is so freakishly important. That is why sense restraint is so important, and all the other aspects of the gradual training that the Buddha talked so much about that are frequently ignored nowadays. Because oftentimes people just want to skip ahead. And by the way, this is also something that I obviously did too, when we come back to the mistakes that we did. I also wanted the jhana stuff in the very beginning. And then I had to, go back and fix the stuff that I had left out, namely the virtue part. So that is also a big mistake. Yeah. Anything else, or should we move on?
Let's move on.
Perfect. Then we have another question that has been asked many times. Why do you and don't you read a bit of Teacher X or practice a bit more like Teacher Y? They are really good. They help me a lot. You can surely profit from them too. This is a question that I have generalized very much from suggestions all over YouTube that people send me all the time. And yeah, I will say a word on that too, but maybe you can begin.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different teachers out there, but I think we talked about it before, but there is a level at which, if you want to become a Sotapanna, the only teacher that you can take is the Buddha himself. And That's kind of the thing that you want to realize, is that any teacher you have, you don't really want to follow them. You kind of just want them to give you the tools, basically, to understand what the Buddha's saying, and then you kind of leave that teacher behind. So in that sense, there is no really like practicing like this teacher or practicing like this teacher. It's just basically either you're practicing as the Buddha taught, and that's only like a singular way, basically, or you're on your way there and you're just basically finding out the tools that you need, or finding out more information, measuring out the practice, so you're able to understand the Buddha. But apart from that, you can't really say that you're following a particular teacher outside of the Buddha, because if you are, then there is some sort of distance between your understanding and what the Buddha taught. Well, I feel like you might have more to say about this question.
Maybe, but not much, to be honest. The Buddha was quite clear on that. The other people are just there to help you understand the Dhamma. And it is always the same Dhamma that you must do or not do, as it's much more about stopping to do certain things. And when you have a teacher that teaches you something that is not what the Suttas say, and who is not pointing you to what the Suttas or helping you to understand the Suttas, then it's probably not very good to do that. But this is also, it's very important to keep in mind that all this is given that you want to become a Sotapanna, given that you want to practice the Dhamma and what the Buddha really taught. Many people don't want that, and that is perfectly fine, to be honest. But on this channel, we pretty much only try to teach you that. So keep that in mind at all times. So when we answer a question, it's always kind of through that lens. So that's important to keep in mind. So yeah, the role of a teacher is just to clear up the perplexing points that are left by the suttas, because many of the statements cannot be understood without some help, initially at least, because they go against your very experience. And that is, in my opinion, the role of a teacher. So whenever you run into a dead end, he is there to pull you back, because it is our natural inclination of mind to go down the wrong road. That's what's natural, that what comes easy, and we have to have the criticism and the guidance of another to not do that in one way or another. Can be videos, books, or whatever, depending on how deep down the sensuality rabbit hole you are. The deeper down you are, the more instruction you need. But you should also weaken your craving, otherwise all the instructions in the world cannot help you. And yeah, so in essence, it's just the suttas are the ultimate guide. The Buddha said so in the suttas. So you should always strive to understand them, and just take as much assistance as necessary for that from others. So don't grow too dependent. That's pretty much all I can say. Yeah, anything else? Or shall we move on?
Let's move on.
Perfect. Now we have another question from George. And George wants to know, what is the difference between Tanha and Upadana, and what are they individually? Was it my turn or was it yours?
It's your question.
Okay. Yeah. What is Tanha? Well, Tanha is most frequently translated as craving, while Upadana is, I think, most frequently translated as clinging. So those two both occur in the chain of dependent origination that the Buddha laid out, and I think the more primordial element is Tanha, and then there comes Upadana, and then all the other elements like Bhava, Jati, and aging, illness, death, clinging in the very end. And the way I would like to translate Upadana is more akin to assumption. I like Thero's translation a lot when it comes to that. I think that's the word he chooses. And I think a good way to think about Upadana is the assumptions of sensuality, the assumptions of external, the assumptions that your entire experience is based upon, so to speak, which are based on craving, so to speak. So the Upadana is more or less a result of the craving. I think that's maybe a good way of putting it. Maybe you have another take on the topic.
Yeah, I think what you say is right as far as the dependent origination chain goes, but I mean, the problem obviously is that the Buddha talks about Upadana in different ways as well. Tanha is usually just one way, it's just craving. But he also talks about Upadana in the sense of like the lower fetters, like self-view is Upadana, clinging to rites and rituals is Upadana, it's assumption and clinging. And in that sense of Upadana, that comes first, and Tanha kind of comes second, in the sense that you kind of be secluded from Tanha. You can be in the jhanas, but the Upadana or self-view can remain completely as a framework for your experience. So Upadana in that sense is more of a framework, whereas Tanha is something that's experienced kind of here and now. But yeah, the way the Flaus was saying is also a way you can understand Upadana. So you just have to differentiate between which way you're thinking about it.
Yeah, it's actually a good question in what way the question is actually meant. But I guess it is good to point out both ways, because that might actually be the crux of the question. Because as soon as one word is used in multiple contexts and may seem very different, like the word Sankhara, I think that leads to a lot of perplexion when it comes to practice. But yeah, the views that are... Yeah, the views, as you said, are more the framework, because they give rise to future craving. Yeah. So in that sense, they are more primordial. But yeah, well, that's always a problem with Dhamma. Yeah.
But even then, like they're kind of reciprocal as well. Like the more Tanha, the more fuel Upadana has, and yeah, Upadana is obviously a fuel for Tanha. So they're very much linked. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also the problem. The Buddha talked about in certain ways about certain parts of the practice. Sometimes he talked in a structural manner when it comes to the chain of dependent origination. Sometimes he talked in the manner of nutriments when it comes to certain types of food that sustain, for example, your wrong assumptions and your craving and everything. And then there are yet other ways that he talked about the practice of Dhamma. And that tends to bring a lot of confusion to beginners. But in the end, the instructions he gave are pretty much always the same. So when it comes to practice, there shouldn't be much confusion. There should be just you doing it. And yeah. Yeah, anyway, I think we should move on.
Yeah.
Perfect. Then we have another question from George, and he asks, by the way, what's your take on omission in suttas? Leaving out suttas or abbreviating them? I think that question refers to all the dotted, left out parts of the suttas. And I think that's your question. I will also say something.
Oh, you mean like in the translations?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I do find that annoying sometimes. I mean, especially like in the Samyutta Nikaya, for example, when there's a lot of like 20-30 sutras around the same thing, and then it's a bit annoying because you just have it's just like 30 sutras being missed out. But a lot of the time when it's just like a certain part of the sutras being repeated and it's just like 2 or 3 sutras, I can understand that. Yeah, it's a bit annoying in the Samyutta Nikaya. I think sometimes in the Anguttara Nikaya.
I think those two are the main offenders when it comes to leaving out sometimes entire suttas, which is just, I think Bodhi's translations have that quite often, that there is a new introduction, then a new last sentence of the sutta, and then the middle part is the exact same as in the sutta before, and all that is omitted, which is not so nice. I think at least in the online context, you could solve that much better. You could just, I don't know, add an expand button or something on Sutta Central, and then it would make that much more digestible for beginners, because always having to look back to other suttas is very inconvenient for people who are just starting their practice. But I can also understand that there are omissions and that there are dotted parts, because there is a lot of repetition in the suttas. And if you would write down all the suttas, then I think you could fill an entire bookshelf with just the suttas, because they are very verbose. So some repetition is necessary, at least some omission is necessary, at least if you want to print it as a book. I think there's no good other way. At least none that is also feasible, as in that you can just have 4 or 5 books that everyone can order, and then they have access to all the suttas.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Oh.
But the repetition is sometimes helpful. It's not always good to like just see that there's 30 suttas that are kind of saying the same thing, and then you just kind of like be like, all right, I can skip them. It is good to like read it, because if it is being said this many times, it's probably because it is something that's important. And just the mere fact of like reading them slowly will make it like sink in your head. It make you see the significance of it, basically.
No, that's actually quite important. Because you will have to read, as a standard practitioner at least, you will have to read many suttas many times before the message will actually sink in. And the more repetition, the better. It is just that our advertisement, let's say, tainted minds tend to overlook everything that is repeated too often. So if we can move beyond that, then the sheer amount of repetition should be a very good indicator of what is actually important when it comes to the practice. And I think that might actually also be one of the points why the training in virtue is so overlooked, because the Buddha repeats that in basically every single sutta. And if you have read it so often, then it's easy to just ignore it.
Yeah, I remember where I would like, at some point I'd read enough suttas where I would kind of start reading the beginning of the sutta and I'd be like, oh, I know what the Buddha's going to say. I can just kind of skip over that. Not realizing that like I haven't put that into practice. So I need to be reading that again and again and again until the significance of it becomes apparent.
I was also reading like that. I had to force myself to go back once I noticed that I'm trying to skip ahead. And I was doing that quite frequently until my mind was obeying me and was actually reading what was written there instead of trying to skip ahead. We always want to move to the next part. It's quite natural, but it's not how it's practiced. First, put it into practice, then move on to the next part when your mind is ready. And then other parts of the suttas will appeal to you when your mind is ready for that. Yeah, I think let's move to the next question. And this one is from an anonymous person. And that person wants to know, how can I be sure that I won't forget what Dhamma I have learned? And I guess that question is for me. Yeah, the thing is, overall, the knowledge on Dhamma tends to be kind of slippery. So the mind always wants to move away from Dhamma and move back towards the old ways of sensuality. So in that sense, you only really find a safe point or a point of no return upon attaining the right view. So that is the only point of no return where you can actually make sure or actually be sure that you have now understood the Dhamma. But that is incidentally also the point where you cannot go back anymore. So yeah, it's kind of good to strive towards that. But until then, it is very likely that Dhamma knowledge will elude you, that you will move away from it, unless you are really making an effort and are really diligent in your practice. Only then can you actually make it stick, make it stay. Because the natural way of the human is always against that. Yeah. Anything you want to add?
Yeah. Yeah, until you basically have the right view or develop some degree of Yoniso manasikara, the Dhamma just kind of will be like one thing among others in your life. Like you have the Dhamma here, then you have your job, and then you have your social life, or you have the Dhamma here, and then you have this philosophical system, and it's just like it's one choice among others. But like if you've developed Yoniso manasikara, then it's the ultimate background of all your experience is basically unavoidable, and that's why you can't forget it. So even like we were talking about before about developing Yoniso manasikara through virtue, just trying to see lust, aversion, and distraction as a framework for your existence. Like if you develop that enough, then even if you go back to sensuality, you can't really unsee the lust as a framework for existence. You can't unsee the unwholesomeness of it. So yeah, if you see the signs of your mind, then you can't really forget the Dhamma in that sense. But it just depends on how much you develop that knowledge of the background of the framework of your existence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is quite important to keep in mind. So once you have attained the right view, all the sensuality that you could engage in is kind of tainted. So you cannot really commit to that anymore, because you always have the background knowledge, okay, that won't do me any good. So that will always be with you, and that's not very enjoyable for most people, at least initially, because now they still want to engage in sensuality, but they can't really enjoy it anymore. So there is a period of renunciation going on, and that might not be too pleasant in the beginning, while it is ultimately very liberating. So in summary, the only point where you cannot unlearn the Dhamma anymore is the right view. So yeah, I think let's move to the next question. I think we have time for 2 more. And another anonymous person wants to know, is avoiding school or university or work unwholesome? And this question is for you.
If it's coming out of aversion towards responsibilities and so on, then yeah, it's definitely within the same framework of craving. Like if you just like sit down and do the non-activity, as we said, but it's all coming out of fundamental desire to just avoid doing your responsibilities, then it's just basically continuing the cycle of craving to that extent. So yeah, you can't use Dhamma as a way of avoiding responsibility. It's pretty much complete opposite direction. It's about taking responsibility for your actions and for your mind states. So yeah, but you also don't want to go on the other extent of proliferating it more than it's needed, work and so on. You need to do your responsibilities, but it doesn't mean, spending your entire day in work if you don't need to, and you could be spending that time in seclusion or whatever, practicing the Dhamma.
Yeah, the Buddha named work, talk, and sleep as a hindrance for a sotapanna. I think we said that too in the past. But that does not mean that you should shy all work. Some monks did that. For example, Ajahn Chah frequently gave talks about such a topic, where there were monks who were freakishly lazy, who did not even repair their kutis, or things like that. And this is also not good. You are avoiding your responsibilities there. You should make sure that it is a balance. Do as much work as is necessary, but don't do more than that. The rest of the time should be spent practicing. And again, this will be plainly obvious and very easy to see when you have access to seeing your intentions. Then you can always just know, oh, okay, I'm just doing that to distract myself. And then you can go against that. But again, you need the ability to see greed, aversion, and delusion, to see craving in your experience. Otherwise, you have no good metric to decide when something is wholesome and when something is unwholesome. So again, I think the Buddha gave that as an equivalent definition for the right view, knowing good as good and bad as bad, or beneficial as beneficial and unbeneficial as unbeneficial. Yeah. So the answer is, sadly, it depends on why you do something. Sometimes it is unwholesome, sometimes it is not. So you won't ever find a definitive answer in the suttas, except for very few things, namely the 5 precepts, which are always unwholesome. Apart from that, it always depends on your intentions. Yeah. But given that a person asks such a question, there is already the idea behind that they are probably trying to avoid something. So in that case, it's probably better to do a bit more and do it properly, but not too much either. No. Okay, let's move to the next question. And this one is from another anonymous person, and I think it's the last question for this video. And that person wants to know, I tried mindfulness of death and felt extremely bad, full of dread and terror. What did I do wrong? And I'm not sure if that question is for me, or is it for you?
Yeah, it's for you.
Okay, yeah, from reading that question, it does not even seem that you did something wrong in the sense that you did the mindfulness of death wrong. The thing that you might have been doing wrong is that you did the mindfulness of death in the first place, which is probably a bit too rapid of a transition for you in that context. So mindfulness of death is a very rapid, a very non-gradual way toward the attainment of the right view, for example, or the attainment of arahantship. You can end up at full liberation of mind maybe in 2 weeks if you do it like that. But there's a good chance that you will go mad in the process, because you will literally lose everything that is dear to you, or it will feel like that. The mental ownership is broken up, because if you really are mindful of death, then you notice, I cannot own any of those things that I derive safety from, and then the entire safety is removed from you. And that will feel bad, unless you have a lot of virtue developed beforehand. Then it will just be a nodding off. Yeah, I kind of knew that already, and then you just shrug it off. But yeah, in the end, the Buddhist practice is a practice of renunciation, of relinquishing all your acquisitions, of stilling of all activities of all sankharas. It is a bit like, as Ajahn Chah said, dying before you die. And that is rough if you do it non-gradual. If you do it gradually, perfectly fine. But if you just start doing it out of the blue, unprepared, then it's probably a bit too much. Yeah.
Yeah, it's mindfulness of death is not gonna like automatically purify your experience. You need to do mindfulness of death and then not lose your mind on account of it, and basically stay composed within that degree of non-ownership, which, as the Buddha says, it's not just like merely thinking about death, is seeing basically everything in your experience, including just single out breath, see it as undermined by non-ownership, by death, by everything. And there really is no place to escape with that. So you should develop virtue first, basically. But even like mindfulness for the body, the Buddha says the same thing. Sometimes he says like, mindfulness for the body, it gives great existential dread, or it gives this useful anxiety. And other times he says mindfulness of the body is the greatest fruit. It brings the greatest calm, brings the greatest defilements to end, and so on. The difference between them two is that, like, in the middle, there's been composure that's been developed through the correct conduct, basically. So, yeah, that needs to be developed alongside any contemplation you do. The composure on account of wholesome conduct.
Yeah. A good way to translate composure would be immovability of your mind by feelings. So when there are bad feelings and you are composed, then you are unmoved by them. If you have developed that beforehand, like an unshakable mind, then those things won't move you or touch you as much as before. And then you can stomach it, like many of the ascetics of old who could do that. Until there was a sutta where like 500 monks killed themselves because they could not take it. Then the Buddha introduced mindfulness of breathing as an alternative, which is probably a much better way nowadays. Yeah, I think that is enough for that question, and I think our time is running out for this video, so I think we will call it a day. And I think we will see us again next time. So now is a good time to do all the YouTube stuff, like, subscribe, link the videos to your friends if you know anyone. But yeah, I otherwise wish you a nice day and goodbye.